The mystery of the Edmund Fitzgerald. In all maritime history, few shipwrecks will be remembered more than the loss of the great Edmund Fitzgerald. In his musical tribute to the Fitzgerald, Gordon Lightfoot immortalized the 729-foot freighter's final voyage into the teeth of a vicious Lake Superior storm in November 1975. The story of the shipwreck captured the imaginations of millions of listeners who were drawn to the saga of the proud vessel's demise. Even today, questions remain concerning what happened on the lake that November night. Why did the Fitzgerald, a powerful and thoroughly modern freighter, succumb to the lake's 30-foot waves? How did the ship sink? What can be learned by diving the remains of the wreck? The Mystery of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the latest on Great Lake Shipwrecks by Southport Video, explores these and other questions. Compelling underwater footage of the wreck as it is today, combined with numerous rare photographs, beautiful artwork, computer animation, and expert testimonials provide the story of the Fitzgerald's colorful past and tragic demise. Never before has so much information been offered in one video production. No shipwreck library would be complete without this comprehensive, educational, and entertaining program. The Mystery of the Edmund Fitzgerald 1-hour VHS video is available now. All for only $45, including free shipping and handling. Orders are processed immediately, satisfaction guaranteed. Please allow 1 to 3 weeks for delivery. Russian Canadian delivery available. Sorry, no CODs. We accept Visa and MasterCard. Operators are on duty. Call 414-552-5411. Makes a great gift. If lines are busy, keep trying. For a free brochure, call or write Southport Video today. Now, our feature presentation.
Broken half and it ended up in 2 pieces, and as strange as it may seem, the stern half of the section, which was where the propeller was turning, actually banged into the front half of the vessel and proceeded on for some distance after the bow section had sank, including just missing some of the survivors that were in the water after the bow section had gone down. So it apparently broke in half very, very suddenly. As I said before, there was no chance to get any distress call off because they lost power to the front half, to the bow section, even though they had power and the lights were still on in the after section of the vessel.
One of our friends had called and asked me if I had heard about the ship going down, and I said no. I said, it's nothing to joke about. And he said, yeah. He said, they said it was a Morell. And I thought they were kidding, and so I turned the radio and I didn't hear nothing until later, you know, and I didn't hear it on the radio. Then they had called me and told me by that telegram I got that possibly the ship is down.
The story of the Daniel J. Morell has all the elements of a great shipwreck drama. A storied vessel, long in service on the Great Lakes, yet equipped with all the modern technology, breaks in 2 during a storm on Lake Huron. The date, November 29, 1966. 28 men lost their lives in the disaster, but even in the midst of such terrible loss, an incredible adventure was taking place. While rescue teams searched the shipwreck area, hoping against hope to find someone still alive on the frigid waters of Lake Huron, a lone survivor lay huddled among 3 shipmates on a lifeboat, barely clad and nearly frozen to death, drifting on the lake toward shore, too weak to sit up on the raft or call out for help. That he survived and was eventually rescued after nearly 38 hours of exposure to the elements is a story itself, a lone bright light in a truly tragic tale. The month of November has always presented a challenge to ships traveling on the Great Lakes. The weather during this month can be extremely volatile, with vicious storms whipping up with little or no warning, hammering ships and testing their crews to the limit. A single storm on Lake Huron in 1913 claimed 8 vessels and took dozens of lives.
Particularly, I remember that night that the Daniel J. Morell sank. It changed very rapidly, because when I left port at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, on that afternoon it was fairly flat calm, and in a matter of 3 or 4 hours I was in the worst storm that I can remember on the Great Lakes. And we had seas of 20 to 25 feet, maybe even higher, and the winds were 40 to 60 miles an hour. So it was a really rough, really picked up very rapidly, which is typical on the lakes.
We tend to run 20 years now between major incidents, major losses of vessels. We lost the Fitzgerald, for example, in '75. We lost the Morell in '66. In '58, we lost the Bradley. It seems like it's 10 or 15 or 20 years, a generation between these losses. If we consider the loss of the Mesquite in 1989, we should not be due for another one until about the year 2005. But they do occur. The lakes have not gotten any kinder.
You've got a chop that just beats you to death. It just constantly hits you. It's quick. Whereas at sea, there are long swells, a lot of period between the crests, and in the lakes, it'll just beat you to death. It's a chop.
At the time of its last voyage in November of 1966, the Daniel J. Morell was one of the oldest ships on the Great Lakes, and it had endured its fair share of rough times on the water. Built in 1906 in West Bay City, Michigan, the 600-foot freighter was one of the largest ships on the Great Lakes. In 1924, its owners, the M.A. Hanna Company, sold the Daniel J. Morell to the Cambria Steamship Company, and from that point on, the ship spent most of its time hauling iron ore for Bethlehem Steel, earning the reputation of being a steady, reliable carrier. Over the years, the Morell received new, updated equipment whenever it was needed. New boilers replaced aging ones, and in 1955, the ship received a new Skinner Uniflow engine, replacing the original triple expansion model. What could not be replaced, however, and what would prove to be the ship's undoing, was its aging hull. In 1962, the Morell was taken out of service due to a downturn in the Great Lakes shipping economy. The ship was reactivated 2 years later, in August 1964, and in February 1966, at the beginning of its final season on the lakes, the Morell passed its 5-year inspection.
You walk aboard a ship, and some ships just don't feel right. Some ships feel okay. Some ships feel comfortable. I've had, Woodrush was a ship, for instance, that you felt like you were sitting in your mother's lap in a rocking chair. You were comfortable, you were warm, you knew you were going to be okay.
Ironically, the Daniel J. Morell would not have even been out on the Great Lakes at the time of its demise had it not been for extenuating circumstances. The 1966 shipping season had ended a few days earlier, but the Morell had not yet fulfilled its tonnage commitments to Bethlehem Steel. The Morell and its sister ship, the Edward Y. Townsend, would have to make one more run. On the evening of November 26, 1966, the Daniel J. Morell left Buffalo, New York. Its destination, Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, where it was to pick up a load of iron ore. It was the ship's 34th voyage of the shipping season. At the helm was Captain Arthur Crawley, a 47-year-old veteran of Great Lakes shipping. He had with him a crew of 27 men. At the time of its departure from Buffalo, the Morell was carrying no cargo. The first leg of the voyage was relatively uneventful, even though the Morell encountered some rough weather and in fact dropped anchor just below Detroit to wait for better conditions. The next day, the Morell was off to Windsor, Ontario, where it docked and picked up 221 tons of coal to be used as fuel, along with one more crewman. Then it was back to work for the ship and the 29 men aboard. Captain Crawley was well aware of the problems that bad weather on the lakes could present. He had ballasted the Morell as a precaution against the choppy seas, and throughout his voyage he stayed in contact with the captain of the Edward Townsend, which had left Buffalo a few hours after the Morell, but which had caught up to the Morell when it was anchored in the Detroit River. The two captains discussed the weather reports and what they might expect. It didn't look promising. The captain of the Townsend had listened to radio conversations between ships out on Lake Huron, as well as to radio broadcasts transmitted from the shore, and the weather conditions in the southern part of Lake Huron were deteriorating at a rapid rate. Winds howling out of the north were getting stronger by the hour, and waves on the lake were at an estimated 12 feet and rising. Snow was falling. Still, according to the lone survivor of the Morell shipwreck, the conditions seemed no worse than what he had seen on the lakes on any number of other occasions in the past. By late evening on November 28, the weather conditions were causing grave concern to the captains of both the Daniel J. Morell and the Edward Y. Townsend. Winds had increased to over 50 miles per hour, and 20-foot waves were crashing against the battered ships. Both vessels were having trouble holding course. Decisions had to be made. The Townsend's captain favored guiding his ship to Thunder Bay, where he could drop anchor and benefit from at least minimal protection. Captain Crawley believed that his ship might be safer on the open sea. The Morell, he felt, would be less susceptible to the broaching and twisting that he might experience while anchored in a quartering sea. Both captains considered returning to Port Huron, but they agreed that attempting to turn their vessels around in the high waves would be too dangerous a maneuver. At this point, both captains were deeply concerned about how their respective ships would hold up structurally under the tremendous pounding they were taking in the teeth of the storm. The more recently built carriers on the Great Lakes were built out of materials that offered some flexibility on stormy seas, but the Morell and Townsend had been around for 60 years and were nowhere near as giving under stress in icy water temperatures. When recounting his experiences to an investigatory board looking into the sinking of the Daniel J. Morell, Thomas Connolly, the captain of the Townsend, described the seas as tremendous, adding that he could not remember ever encountering such conditions in his experiences on the Great Lakes. Whether Captain Crawley regretted his decision to stay on the lake will never be known. In the early hours of November 29, at approximately 2 a.m., the Morell's hull began to buckle in a series of ear-shattering bangs, awakening its crew and sending men running for their lives. Geysers of steam from broken lines sprayed the air, and sparks from severed electrical cables lit the night. The Daniel J. Morell was literally being torn in two. In a matter of minutes, the ship had totally split at its 11th hatch, the stern section still under power slamming repeatedly into the bow section, pushing it aside until for a brief time the bow had turned around and slid aside the stern. Then, to the horror of the crewmen gathered on the deck of the bow, the stern, its lights still illuminating the night, continued on into the night, leaving them abandoned on the powerless sinking bow. All that remained was the struggle for survival. The lifeboats on the stern had been lost, so the men gathered around a wooden pontoon-style life raft positioned in the bow section. All told, 13 men, including Captain Crawley, gathered in the life raft and waited for the inevitable. When the bow sank, they would float free from the wreckage on the raft, or so they thought. Nature had other designs. A massive wave washed over the bow, sweeping the men and raft overboard into the choppy water. Only 4 would find the raft and climb aboard. The bow sank quickly, leaving the frightened and freezing men on their own to ponder their fates. Only about 15 minutes had passed between the initial sound of the ships breaking apart and the sinking of the bow. The Daniel J. Morell was now a tragic part of Great Lakes maritime history. Unfortunately for the men trying to survive in the waters of Lake Huron, no one knew the Daniel J. Morell had gone down. No distress signal had been transmitted, and there had been no communication between the Morell and the Townsend since just after midnight. In that final conversation, Captain Crawley had said nothing about his plans, and the captain of the Townsend assumed that he had continued on ahead. Nor was the Townsend captain particularly worried when he received no response when he tried to contact the Morell on 2 occasions in the early hours of December 29. After all, it was not uncommon to experience radio difficulties during bad storms. In fact, a full day would pass before people began to seriously question the whereabouts of the Daniel J. Morell. A dispatcher in Cleveland, concerned when neither the Morell or the Townsend made their daily reports, contacted the Coast Guard and asked of their whereabouts. The Coast Guard located the Townsend, which had stopped for fuel at Lime Island in the lower St. Mary's River. The Morell, of course, was nowhere to be found. Authorities might have suspected the worst when they saw the condition of the Townsend. The deadly storm had taken its toll on the enormous freighter. Rivets had come loose in the ship's deck plating, and a crack had appeared near its number 10 hatch, at almost the same location as the fatal fracture in the Morell. While the Coast Guard dispatcher was busy trying to locate the Morell, answers were being provided on Lake Huron. At 1:12 in the afternoon of November 30, the crew of the GG Post, a steamer traveling near Michigan's Thumb area, sighted a body floating in the lake about 8 miles off Harbor Beach. The man was wearing a life jacket with the name Daniel J. Morell stenciled on it. Less than an hour later, another vessel, the G.A. Tomlinson, reported finding 3 more bodies, as well as wreckage from the ship, about 4 miles from where the first victim had been found. The Coast Guard sprang into action, dispatching 4 helicopters, 2 planes, and 7 ships to sweep the area in a desperate, intense search for survivors, even though it seemed impossible that anyone could have lasted for even an hour in Lake Huron's frigid waters. Search parties walked along the shoreline, looking for bodies that might have been washed ashore. Chuck Milrad was part of the search efforts on Lake Huron.
The irony of the situation was we were so close to the Morell at the time of her sinking, but we didn't know anything about it because she was not able to get a distress call off, because I understand when the vessel broke in half, they lost power to the bridge and they had no backup power for their radios, so they could not call for help because the people did get out into life jackets and some got into life rafts, and there was 1 survivor from the sinking, and there was several other people that died in the water after the ship went down. So we had turned around and headed back south to Port Huron, and we got back in port for almost a day when we first found out about the missing Morell and that there was some crewmen that were being picked up in the water. And they sent us back out to get involved in the search for any survivors from the Morell. And so I searched for about 3 days in the southern part of Lake Huron, along with several other Coast Guard vessels and Coast Guard aircraft. And all told, about 20 bodies were found, and my vessel picked up 8 of the bodies from the ship that we found that were in life jackets and floating on the surface. Of course, by that time they had been in the water for almost 2 days, and they were very cold at the time, and I'm sure hypothermia had set in long before we had picked them up. They had only lasted a short amount of time in that cold water.
More bodies were recovered, the victims either drowned or dead from exposure. The bodies, along with additional debris found floating on the lake, confirmed everyone's worst fears. The Morell had been lost at sea with considerable loss of human life. Then, just when it seemed that all hope was lost, at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon on November 30, a helicopter flying over the shoreline about 3 miles below Huron City, Michigan, reported an astonishing discovery. A life raft with 4 men aboard had been sighted on the beach. Miraculously, one of the men on the raft was still alive. The survivor, a 26-year-old watchman named Dennis Hale, was barely alive. He was huddled among his 3 dead crewmen, suffering from exposure, clad only in his undershorts and a jacket, ice frozen to him. He had frostbite on his feet and his right hand. His body temperature had dropped to 95 degrees, Otherwise, he was in amazingly good condition given the fact that he had just spent 38 hours on the lake. As Hale would later tell doctors and other medical personnel, he had been asleep in his cabin when the Morell began to buckle. Concerned by the loud noise and by the general alarm bells sounding, Hale grabbed his life jacket and moved outside of his room and into the corridor. The electricity was gone. Hale proceeded to the spar deck and looked around, trying to determine exactly what was going on. The bow portion of the Morell was completely dark, while the stern still had electricity. At first, Hale couldn't figure what had happened, but then he noticed the buckling in the center of the vessel. The ship, he realized immediately, was sinking. Hale rushed back to his cabin for some clothes, but could only find his pea coat in the darkness. He slipped it on and returned to the deck, walking barefoot in the slushy snow until he was in the area where the forward pontoon raft was stored. The ship continued to break apart, screeching as its steel hull tore, sending sparks and steam into the air. Hale and a dozen of his shipmates climbed aboard the life raft, only to be swept overboard into the darkened sea. Somehow, he and 3 others managed to find the raft and climb aboard. At the time, water temperatures were 44 to 47 degrees, with waves at 20 to 25 feet. The wind roared at 50 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 60 miles per hour. Air temperature was 33 degrees and falling. The men huddled together to conserve body heat, but to little avail. By morning, 2 of the men had died of exposure, and the 3rd passed away during the next day. Hale had found some flares on the life raft and had fired them at infrequent intervals, but they attracted no attention. Before dying, the last of the 3 men with Hale had mentioned that he thought he could see land, but by nightfall, Hale was too weak to get up and look. It wouldn't have mattered in any event if the life raft had run aground. Hale would not have been able to walk to safety. The hours passed and Hale endured, dropping in and out of consciousness. By the next afternoon, he was terribly hungry and thirsty, as well as nearly frozen. Yet, as he would later testify, when he began to eat the ice that had frozen on his jacket, he suddenly saw an old man in the boat with him, a ghostly presence with long flowing white hair. The old man warned Hale not to eat the ice. Hale heeded his warning. Later in the day, the old man reappeared when Hale, once again overwhelmed by thirst, had started eating the ice on his coat. Doing this, the old man said, would lower Hale's body temperature. Hale put down the ice and drifted out of consciousness. A short time later, Hale heard what he thought were seagulls overhead. The sound, however, was different from the sounds of gulls he had heard before, and to his utter amazement, he looked up and saw a Coast Guard helicopter hovering above him. He lifted a weak arm and gave the helicopter a wave. His ordeal was finally coming to an end. Shipwrecks can exact a terrible price on the living, whether they be actual survivors of the disaster or family members of the deceased. This was certainly the case with the Daniel J. Morell. Dennis Hale was tormented by the fact that he alone had survived the tragedy. He found the media attention and inaccurate reporting intolerable, and after a while he quit talking to the press altogether. He had numerous operations on his damaged feet and toes. He suffered through a variety of personal problems, including 3 failed marriages and troubles with drug abuse. Just living a normal life was a struggle. For those who lost loved ones on the Morell, there were times of grief and loneliness and despair. For Jenny Main, the loss of her husband was almost more than she could bear.
Because I didn't want nothing to do with my kids, my 2 girls. I didn't want nothing to do with them. I wanted to die. I loved him. He was my life. I wanted to die. And they put me in Riverside Hospital to bring me out of the shock of it. They put me right by the window, and the light ships would come through there blowing, and I'd go off my mind. And they said that's the only way they could shock me out of it. Well, I still didn't, that still didn't do it at all. And so my brother got a hold of this friend of his, a lady friend, and she pretended to be a social worker from the welfare that come to take my kids away because I didn't want them, and the kids would be put up for adoption. And 2 girls would. And I said I didn't care. And then Darlene, the oldest, she was 4, she says, Mama, I love you. Love me back. And that was it. And I started coming out a little bit at a time.
But I remember going to the hospital, and I do remember hearing the boats go by on the river. And she was just laying there, just kind of staring off into space. It seemed like she didn't recognize us or anything. She just kind of was out of it, just staring off into space. And it seems like it was my uncle that took me up there. And I remember looking down at her and saying, I love you, Mommy. I love you. I love you. Please love me back. Please come home. I remember asking her to come home because I was, like I said, I thought I was going to be at my uncle's forever.
There's always going to be the memories, and they can't take them away from me. Nobody can take memories away from somebody. Like I say, it's still there, the love's still there, and it'll never go away. I just feel bad for the other people that had to go through the same thing. But God knows what He's doing. Nobody knows any better than Him.
In the aftermath of the sinking of the Daniel J. Morell, an investigation was held to determine why it had sunk. The panel concluded that the Morell's structural failure was due to steel made brittle in the icy waters. The ship's pitching and rolling in the storm had caused the steel to crack, leading to the actual splitting of the Morell's hull. For maritime historians and Great Lakes divers, the Daniel J. Morell continues to be a compelling study. Oddly enough, the whereabouts of the ship's 2 sections remained somewhat of a mystery for nearly 13 years after its sinking. On January 7, 1967, a Coast Guard cutter located the stern section, resting upright in 220 feet of water about 16 miles north of Point Aubarquet, Michigan. Unfortunately, the exact location was not accurately charted until it was rediscovered by Dave Trotter and Larry Copeland in May 1979. Trotter and Copeland also located the ship's bow at that time. Sitting upright on the bottom of Lake Huron, the bow of the Daniel J. Morell was an undiscovered treasure in the lake's murky waters. And for Trotter and Copeland, finding the wreckage was an emotional experience. It also solved the mystery about how far the severed stern section had traveled after its separation from the bow. Incredibly, the stern had lumbered through the storm for 5 miles before sinking. Diving the wreck of the Daniel J. Morell is a challenge. The relatively deep locations of the 2 sections make it an advanced divers-only adventure, and even then, one has to be extremely cautious in exploring the wreckage. The rewards, however, are many.
At least all the diving I've done in both Lakes Huron and Lake Michigan is pretty limited visibility stuff. 10 feet max, maybe 15 feet on a good day. Now that has its own appeal. The ship, especially if it's a large ship and if it's fairly intact, it sort of reveals itself to you gradually, which is, to me, again, as a very sincere ship nut, that's great, because you have to kind of go looking for stuff, and you maybe make 25 dives on a wreck before you see the whole thing, and you sort of piece the mosaic together gradually.
The remains of the SS Daniel J. Morell's forward section, or bow, resting in approximately 200 feet of water. The diver proceeds along the top-back side of the pilot, or wheelhouse. A surrealistic atmosphere is present here. One of her several intact portholes. one of the vessel's cable mounts. Now on the starboard or right side of the bow. The diver penetrates the captain's quarters. A lot of debris lay about the stricken cabin. A sink and toilet still in remarkably good condition. An open porthole. The diver locates 2 freshwater burbot, nicknamed lawyerfish. Now back out on deck, some outside benches. The diver opens a sheltered top opening that leads into the lower hold of the vessel. Now entering the third mate's quarters. Once again, a lot of rubble, including a sink. The letters that spell out the ship's name, located at the port, or left side of her bow. A brief glimpse into one of the ship's holds. The diver advances into the dunnage room. This area was used primarily as storage for miscellaneous gear, canvas, ropes, etc., but was also occasionally used for extra sleeping space. Notice the remains of a box spring bed along with fallen panels. The diver explores the wreckage, stirring up some silt as he moves along. Yet another sink lays still. The entrance to the gyro room, used to house the ship's master gyro compass, and the crew's hall, which was the crew's sleeping quarters. Now a quick tour of the Morell's pilot house, still containing many of her navigational equipment, minus the ship's wheel. Now on the top of the pilot house, a searchlight is still mounted on the ship. This was taken the first time the ship was ever dived on, and is now missing. The divers proceed to the top of the Morell's mast to locate the ship's logo. A circled C stands for the Cambria Steamship Company, which merged into the Great Lakes Steamship Company division of the Bethlehem Steel Corporation in 1963. Now at the stern section at a depth of 225 feet, the diver, with camera gear in hand, has just entered the engine room in the stern through the skylight. A 300 to 400 pound steam whistle attached to the engine exhaust stack. One can see the steam whistle with damaged shroud above it, and the ladder used to service the whistle still attached to the smokestack. Along the port side, at the stern, is an entrance labeled engine room. The hallway leading to the engine room was cluttered with unfurled hoses, making it impossible to enter the engine room located down this hallway. The diver with camera lights on is outside and just beginning to enter the engine room. Note the portholes that are part of the skylights, which are hinged to open and close. Twin emergency steering wheels located near the stern and on the top of the cabins. They would be used to manually control the rudder should the steering system in the pilot house fail. Diver with camera lights blazing, attempting to photograph the Morell engine room in the silt and darkness. Stern telegraph, located at the stern of the ship, with the faceplate broken. Now port side at the stern cabins, deck level, is the entrance to pantry. The door was open and a clock on the wall had stopped at 3:25. Now inside the engine room, about 2/3 the way down the catwalk to the floor of the engine room. The engine room is at least 4 to 5 stories high when entered from the skylight. The life preserver container, partially open, on top of the stern cabins, toward the front of the stern cabin roof. One can ponder if panicked seamen had ripped it open in an effort to save themselves. The tragedy of the Daniel J. Morell prompted shipping and Great Lakes officials to make significant changes, including new standards in the kind of survival equipment stored on board for emergency situations. Most important, officials agreed that the use of older bulk carriers had to be limited in the late fall season. This included all ships constructed before 1948, when shipbuilders began using a less brittle type of steel on their freighters.
Well, there were a number of safety changes that always come out of these investigations. One of the main ones in the case of the Morell was to have an auxiliary power system for the radios on the bridge, mainly battery operation, so that if the ship's power failed, it would automatically shift over to battery power and you would still have radio communications. Of course, nowadays there's a lot of portable radios also that they carry on the bridge that they could call somebody else. I believe they also changed some of the lifeboat regulations, and they had vessels carry these rubber inflatable life rafts as opposed to the wooden life rafts. The Morell had wooden life rafts on which the one survivor that was rescued got off the ship on along with 3 other crewmen, but the 3 others died on the raft because there was very little protection for them from the cold weather. If you have the rubber life rafts with the canopy that can go over the top, you get a little more protection when you're out in the life raft. There's more frequent inspections of the vessels, particularly as they get into the fall season. The Coast Guard inspects the vessels a little more often to check on their material condition and also their safety equipment. The navigation is better than what it used to be in that we have the GPS navigation systems and the LORAN system. The radars are better now than they used to be. I think the masters of the vessels are a little bit more cautious based on these previous sinkings that have happened on the lakes, and they watch the weather a little more carefully. And then too, the weather forecasts are better these days than they used to be because of the advanced weather reporting systems that you have now with the weather radar systems, and they get a much better forecast than what they used to get using the older weather systems that they had.
There was one odd historical footnote to the Daniel J. Morell story. Shortly after the Great Storm of 1966, the Edward Y. Townsend was sold for scrap to a firm in Spain. However, on October 7, the Townsend broke in 2 and sank, just like its sister ship. The wreck of the Daniel J. Morell, like the wrecks of the Edmund Fitzgerald and Carl D. Bradley, will always be of major interest to Great Lakes historians. All 3 ships went down in modern times when it seemed inconceivable that such a loss could occur. At the very least, they stand as convincing testament to the incredible power of nature asserted against once mighty vessels.
Morell.